This session is part of a webinar series which aims to assist researchers, librarians, and institutions in the adoption of digital tools and persistent identifiers for a significant increase of research discoverability globally and to increase efficiency in scholarly workflows. So thank you all for joining us today and welcome to our webinar series on open science for the discoverability of African research. My name is Ebuka Izike, the project manager at Africa COAR, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. So in case you're just hearing about Africa COAR is a community-led digital archive for African research communication. So by enhancing the visibility of African research, we enable discoverability, collaboration opportunities for African scientists on the continent as well as globally. So as we go on, let me take you through a quick overview of how the session is going to be. So we are going to start off by introducing our guests. And after that, we'll go right into our Q&A session, our presentation by our guests. And then after the presentation, which is to take about 20-30 minutes, we'll go right into the Q&A session. And during the Q&A session, you'll be availed the opportunity to ask whatever question you would like to ask surrounding the topic. And then you can do that by either unmuting your mic and asking out loud or typing your questions in the Q&A section of this meeting. And as the moderator, I will still be asking more questions if time permits us. So today we welcome our speaker in the person of Kathleen Shearer, and she is the Executive Director of the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, that's COAR for short. And she will be speaking on the topic, the role of COAR in advancing open access in Africa. But before we listen to what she has for us today, here is a little about her. So Kathleen Shearer is the Executive Director of COAR, like I said, which stands for Confederation of Open Access Repositories. And she's also a global leader in open access and open science. With nearly 20 years of experience, she has built a worldwide network of repositories and worked with organizations like UNESCO, LIBSENSE Africa, and the Research Data Alliance to advance open science. Kathleen has led key initiatives like COAR's Next Generation Repositories and COAR Notify, setting new standards for repository functionality. Based in Montreal, Canada, her work has strengthened repositories as vital infrastructure for open science and supported Diamond Open Access publishing. Once again, thank you all for joining us today. And now over to our speaker, Kathleen Shearer.
Well, thank you so much, Ebuka, for the nice introduction. Just going to share my slides here, which are not at the beginning. There we go. And they should be in full slide mode now.
Yes, it is.
Okay, great, good. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, if only, virtually. I'm in a very cold environment right now in Montreal. We're in the middle of winter, and I, unfortunately, am coming to you with a bit of a cold. So please excuse me if I have to cough here and there throughout my presentation. So maybe a little bit about COAR. We are an international association, as Ebuka mentioned, and actually we are our office is based in Europe, and COAR evolved out of a European project to connect repositories in Europe. And at the end of that project, the leads, PIs and so on said, well, it doesn't really make sense just to connect repositories in Europe because, you know, science and research is actually global, and we should be really working on creating a global network of repositories to be able to preserve and provide access to research outputs. So COAR was launched in 2009 with this as the fundamental mission of the organization. And we do quite a bit of work these days. There's a lot of activity at COAR. Much of it would be relevant to the African continent and repositories in Africa. So, but it's not necessarily targeted specifically at Africa. So our main sort of 4 areas of work are to advocate for repositories and really make the case that repositories are critical infrastructure for open science. And we do that with various international bodies, and when needed and when we can be helpful at the national level with policymakers as well. We want to strengthen repositories, so that essentially means like helping repositories adopt good practices at the local level. So trying to identify what are the good practices for repositories, and be using our, you know, very widespread community to identify those practices, making sure that they aren't so high a bar that repositories cannot adopt them, but that are essentially moving repositories in the direction that we feel they're more sustainable and have greater functionality. And then the third area is alignment, and this is about interoperability, which is actually critical for the global repository network, because our vision is not just about many repositories living in silos in the international ecosystem, but it's about actually being able to build services on top of the collective content of repositories. And the only way you can do that is if repositories are interoperable and have certain kind of behaviors, common behaviors. And then the fourth area is innovation. And well, we've done a number of things, including what Abuka mentioned was the Next Generation Repository Project, and moving from there to the COAR Notify project. And I will speak more about that later on in my presentation. I think it's important also just to state right up front what are our principles. One is that we believe strongly that knowledge is a public good, and commercialization of, you know, the basic research is not necessarily the way society should be going. We should be making the results of research openly available to the world. And this is essentially pushing back on these commercial companies that are publishing in the subscription-based model, because as we know, many countries, many institutions are not able to pay those subscription costs. So we really think all of published literature should be openly available to everyone. Sorry, I was one early. So, and then the other, I think, important foundational conceptual model we think of is, you know, what do researchers really want? We know that what they're supposed to want is to publish in prestige journals, because that's how they get rewarded. But researchers, if you ask them what they really want, is they just really want to have access to a variety of content in the ecosystem so that they can build their research on that content. So they want to be able to have access to data, to all articles immediately, to the peer reviews so they can see whether they agree with a peer review of articles, to software and so on. And so I think we try to keep this in mind, because there are a lot of narratives that talk about researchers wanting to publish in prestige journals, but this is because of our very unhealthy assessment system rather than what really researchers want. So from that perspective, I think repositories we believe very much that repositories are fundamental for achieving these visions. And we are at a moment now, actually, where policies are very favorable towards repositories. So in the early days, you will likely recall of open access, there was a big movement to try to, flip the scholarly commercial journals by paying them a lot of money. After about 15 years of this, we sort of began to understand that this wasn't going to work, and it was also not very beneficial for developing countries. So most of the policies, government policies around open access and open science we see now are very favorable for repositories and require deposit into a repository. And then I think the other aspect about repositories that is really important to keep in mind is that they really support something that we call bibliodiversity. So again, if we look at the traditional system that was very much based on English language journals based in the global north, in particular, UK and the Netherlands and the United States, this really had a big impact on the kind of research outputs and articles and actually research that was being undertaken as scientists and researchers tried to publish in those journals. But what we are starting to realize now is how important bibliodiversity is and how important it is for different countries and different researchers to be able to publish on the priorities that they have around them in their own local conditions. So I think repositories also are key for this. They are localized, shall we say, for the most part, and they allow researchers to be able to share, content that is of interest to their local populations. So at COAR, our mission really is to position repositories as the foundation of a distributed, globally networked infrastructure for scholarly communication, on top of which layers of value-added services can be deployed. And we hope that this will actually lead to, a transformation of scholarly publishing and scholarly communication over the years, making it more innovative and also more in the hands of the scholarly community as opposed to the commercial industry. So for your information, we don't know exactly how many repositories there are. We think there's about 6,000 open access repositories around the world. The current directory of open access repositories, there are several of them, are not particularly up to date, so it's hard to have a really accurate understanding of what the current repository landscape is, and that's also something that COAR would like to address, and I'll explain more about that a little later. But all that to say, there are a lot of repositories. And for us, we are developing resources at COAR that are not just for our 160 members. Our 160 members play a leadership role, but all of our resources that we develop are openly available to all repositories around the world. And so here you can see some of the things that we've published recently. We have a community framework for good practices in repositories that is very relevant for all repositories. We have some recommendations about how repositories can manage multilingual articles and other types of content in their repository. We have recommendations for collecting preprints. We have a core vocabulary, which is translated into 27 languages, a resource type vocabulary, so that if you're identifying the type of resource that's being deposited into the repository, you can have a standard vocabulary for that, like a preprint, for example. And then that's interoperable with other repositories that have preprints but are identifying them in a different language. And we have been hosting the Directory of Open Access preprint repositories, excuse me, which was originally developed by a French organization, CCSD, and is now being hosted by COAR. And what we're in the process of doing is launching a more general international repository directory. And so we will be ingesting the data from this preprint repository into that international repository directory, which we hope to launch in June 2025. And I think there's a very important opportunity to work with AfricArchive on populating that with the information that you have already been collecting around repositories in Africa, because one of the things that we notice in these directories is they tend to be, as you know, won't be a surprise to you, tend to be sort of Western world centric, and there can be a lot of gaps when it comes to infrastructures in developing countries. Excuse me. So one of the things that's really helped, push open science forward in the last couple of years and put it really on the radar of governments is the UNESCO recommendation on open science, which was unanimously adopted by all UNESCO member countries in 2021. And so this was like right in the midst of COVID. And I think it was very obvious at the time why sharing research outputs is so important, because there was a very practical example in terms of for government bureaucrats to be able to see the value of that. And so I think it's been very helpful in terms of moving open science forward at the policy level in many countries. And the other thing that's really great about this recommendation is that it really focuses on creating a global infrastructure that reflects the needs of different countries. So I'm going to cough again, sorry. So research can be global, but it also can be local. There's been a lot of focus on the global aspect of research, publishing in international journals and researchers being incentivized, shall we say, to find topics that would be of interest at the global level, at the international level, by Western research communities. And I think what we want to do as a community, and the UNESCO recommendations very much support this, is to also think about the value and importance of research that is relevant to local populations, but may not be relevant at the global level. And so we see these local infrastructures like repositories and local journals as being very important to support that need. So some of the questions that we've been asking ourselves are, how can we achieve this balance where we're supporting local needs, but also we can have a international visibility and discoverability? How can we maintain infrastructures when in funded environments? How can we redirect funding away from the commercial publishers towards local infrastructures that support our needs? And how can we change the current research assessment system and evaluation systems, which really incentivize publishing in those prestige journals? So just very briefly, I wanted to mention some of the work that we're doing on multilingualism and maybe take a little bit of a deeper dive into this, because I think it could be very relevant for Africa and African colleagues. And one of the things that the Helsinki Initiative on Multilingualism has asserted, and I think it's probably very true, that the disqualification of local or national languages in academic publishing is the most important and often forgotten factor that prevents societies from actually using and taking advantage of the research done where they live. So we really need to rethink this whole thing, where we're really trying to achieve, the highest status of publishing in international journals, and think about how could our research benefit our societies. And so we have come out with some recommendations about how you can ensure that even if you're publishing in a local language, in a repository, for example, you include the metadata in English in a way that it also becomes part of the international global knowledge commons, because what we don't want is also that research to be siloed only in those countries as well. So moving on to specifically some of the work that we've been doing in Africa, just more broadly, obviously, if there are 6,000 repositories around the world, it's very hard for COAR to have a relationship with each repository. So what we have been doing is we have our members, and we engage with the broader repository community, but we've also been working with various national and regional networks to try to help, strengthen those repository networks in those various locations. So you can see we have La Referencia, which is in Latin America, USRN in the United States, Open Air in Europe, and most of the work that we've been doing in Africa is through the LIBSENSE project. And LIBSENSE was launched by the West and Central Research and Education Network, based in Ghana, I guess, their office. But they're basically an NREN, and they realized that there's limitations to just having a pipeline to send information back and forth, but you actually need to build services so that there's content to send through that pipeline. And so actually, this is where I probably first encountered Jo Haveman from Africa Archive, and I think she's also contributing. Africa Archive, I think, is also part of the LIBSENSE project. And we originally started with kind of capacity building, having a number of workshops, trying to build awareness about open science and open access in the various regions of Africa. And now I think there are more specific and concrete projects that are being undertaken there, specifically working with public health initiatives, and also developing infrastructure to support sharing research outputs in Africa. So I just put this up here because, and you all probably have the answer to this, but why are African researchers left behind in global scientific publications? And I think, I've already touched on a number of the reasons. There are biases against research papers in Africa, but I also think there's an issue around infrastructure and investments in Africa to be able to support scholarly activities and scholarly communications as well. So the last thing I'd like to leave you with really is a new model, and this is sort of what we're trying to do in terms of innovation at COAR, is a new model of scholarly publishing that I think could be very interesting and more easily adopted in places like Africa. And it's called the Publish, Review, Curate model. And basically, it sort of decouples the publishing functions across several different infrastructures. So it basically builds on repositories or preprint servers as the place where you deposit your article. And then externally, another service undertakes the peer review or journal publishing, so that you're not moving content back and forth. You're not building a big integrated workflow for scholarly publishing, but you're distributing the functions across a repository and a peer review system. And essentially, that's what the COAR Notify project is. We are developing a common protocol. So basically, we're developing a way that repositories and peer review services can interact with each other in a common way, so that this kind of interaction can scale beyond one-to-one. And it comes from a number of years of work that we've been doing at COAR. In 2016, we launched the Next Generation Repository Initiative, looking at like what are the future roles for repositories. And one of the major use cases that came out of that was connecting the content in repositories with peer review. So we developed a conceptual model essentially in 2020, and we launched the project in 2021, and we received a significant amount of funding through the Arcadia Foundation to be able to advance the adoption of COAR Notify. So we have quite a bit of money that we are using to develop the protocol, provide support, but also sub-grants to invest in the development of services and infrastructures and platforms that want to adopt this functionality. I'll just briefly go through what it looks like kind of on the ground. So an author would deposit a preprint, for example, in AfricArchive, and they knew of a review service that they wanted to request a review from. So they would press a button and a request for a review would be sent. The review service would receive the request and go and read the preprint in AfricArchive and decide whether they wanted to review it or not. And if they did, they would acknowledge the request. The review would take place. Sometimes in the background, there could be, revisions requested and so on, as we typically see in scholarly publishing. And eventually the review would be made available, or reviews, often more than one review, and the AfricArchive record of that preprint would link to the reviews, and vice versa. The review service would link back to the article in AfricArchive. So we're into our third year of the project now. We've already done development here with these various services. So on your right here are all repositories, and here are 2 peer review services. And so all of these repositories are now able to request reviews from these different services here. And here's another group of implementers. Here are the repositories, and then here are the peer review services. And Sciety is actually it's an aggregator. It's run by eLife, but it's an aggregator of open peer reviews. So they're also using COAR Notify to identify new reviews. So this green line means that they go up to the peer review services in the other slide as well. So the idea really is this ecosystem continues to grow and flourish, and we create a very vibrant alternative to the traditional walled gardens of the commercial publishers. So we've also invested in development in open source repository systems so that they can kind of out of the box provide this functionality to their authors. And the development has been completed in DSpace and open preprint systems. Kotahi is actually a review service. So they've also adopted Core Notify. And then here we're working on these other open source platforms as well. So we think, that actually publish, review, curate model could play a really important role in the expanding Diamond open access ecosystem in the future. We very much hope so. We think it is a low cost and also a more transparent way of publishing. So it has a lot of benefits beyond traditional publishing, and that it can also give us a kind of a competitive advantage over the commercial publishers because we can create this very interconnected ecosystem. And well, this is already being implemented here in Africa. Baobab, which is the Walkerin repository, has started an initiative with the Kotahi platform. They're launching a peer review service in Africa. Walkerin is as well, and so they will be able to support this model very soon, I think. And I'm hoping too that Africa Archive might be interested in considering being one of the adopters of this model as well. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, and I welcome any comments or questions you might have.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kathleen, for that wonderful presentation. It was indeed great, and then we learned a lot about the activities of COAR and what they are doing in helping to promote open access and open science in Africa. All right, so we're moving straight into the session where we'll be asking questions. So I'm throwing these to the members of the audience. So if you have any questions for Kathleen or any questions at all surrounding the topic of discussion, this is the point where you ask. Okay, so you can ask your questions by first or either typing them in the chats or in the Q&A section of this meeting, or you can unmute and then ask out loud. Okay, so if you have any question, you can just signify by putting up your virtual hand and I'll call you up to ask your question. Once again, thank you all for joining us. So while we wait for them, I guess I'll just ask the few questions I have before anybody from the audience asks his or her questions. So thank you again, Kathleen, for this wonderful presentation.
Hey, Buka, you may not have noticed the questions in the Q&A.
Sorry?
There's some questions in the Q&A.
Yes, yes, I do remember, yes. Thank you very much.
Ah, okay. All right.
So I just got a question from Joe. Okay, Joe is responding to your question as to whether we will be adopting COAR Notify. So she said, indeed, we have initiated discussions to adopt COAR Notify for Africa. So, and then she's asking a follow-up question. She said, what are the eligibility criteria to adopt COAR Notify? So are there some criteria, requirements for us to adopt the platform?
Yes, it's a protocol. So basically it uses linked data notifications. So you need to set set up an inbox and an outbox to be able to send and receive those notifications. And then typically, you know, you have to process the notifications when they come in. So like they have to go somewhere, either emailed to the author or to a repository manager or something like that. So there is technical development that has to be done on a system. What we're trying to do, as I mentioned in my slides, is that we're trying to invest in all the open source repository systems to be able to make them COAR notified so that not every individual repository has to do it on their own, but it comes sort of out of the box when you download the software. But of course, this will only be available in the newer versions of those software platforms.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. If there's a follow-up question, I guess Joe is going to also type that in the chat. But so let's just go ahead with the questions in the Q&A section, because I see there are a number of questions here. So Batri is asking, how can we help publishers in Africa to upgrade their scientific outputs and make it available worldwide? And then he says, we are indexal data, I think that's incorporated, sponsor, perfect, that's not so clear. But then the major question is, how can we help publishers in Africa to upgrade their scientific output and make it available worldwide?
Yeah. I don't know if I have an answer to that question. I mean, I think part of the issue is that there's already a bias against African scientific output. So I was on a panel in the UK a few months ago with an African researcher who said the only way she could get published was if she added, you know, a Western researcher to the name of her, you know, as a co-author on her article. So I think part of the issue is outside of what Africa can do. But I do think there's also, you know, there is a growing awareness that that the way research is being assessed is not objective in that sense. On the other hand, in terms of what we can do in the African context, I think, you know, making sure that the data is sound, you know, behind so if the research claims in the article are based on data, that the data is well managed and that, you know, it falls, you know, shall we say, from the results of that data. I think, you know, there's biases against English, you know, if you're writing in English language and it's your second language. So helping, you know, getting help with making sure that the English language is very well articulated in the article. You know, I really believe that building and investing in African infrastructures is a way to go as well. Like, instead of trying to publish only in international journals, let's build the quality of the African journal ecosystem together so that it, you know, it reflects a really strong and good African ecosystem, and then maybe there will be less questions about that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. There is another question here from Besem, and Besem is saying, what about DOI in Quora Notify? Is there an identifier for the first version of preprints and another ones for pre-reviewed version?
Yeah, well, not all of our implementers use DOIs, but we could say that there is a separate URL for each version of the article. And that's actually critical to the conceptual model, because if you imagine going through several versions and then you have different reviews that are commenting on a second or a third version, you would want to know which version of that article is related to those reviews. So some of our implementers have chosen not to use DOIs, but they will definitely use a separate URL for each version of the article.
Okay. All right, thank you very much for that wonderful answer. All right, the next, okay, I guess this is an observation. Paco is saying he joined the meeting late. Okay. All right, Paco, we are going to share the slides. I'm going to drop the link in the chat very soon. The slides will be made available. The slide alongside the recording of this webinar session will be made available to everyone. So Annette is asking, how can individuals get involved with this initiative?
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of ways. I mean, in terms of COAR, we're an organization that has members of institutions. So organizations and institutions, we don't have individual memberships. But in terms of the LIBSENSE project, with who we're working with, and I also think possibly Africa Archive, there probably are a number of ways of getting involved and a number of communities of practice. So, well, in terms of LIBSENSE, if you send me an email, I'd be happy to put you in touch with the people who are running that organization, and I'm sure they'd be happy to put you on their mailing list and get you involved wherever you might be interested. Participate.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that wonderful answer. All right. I hope that's clear, Annette. And then the next question here says, this is from Lydia, and she's asking, how do institutions join COAR, and what are the requirements? Okay. I think you've touched on that. Jill has asked that before. So I guess we'll just move to the next one. Or would you like to still add a little thing there?
Just maybe mention a couple of things. One is we don't, as long, basically you have to be a not-for-profit organization, you know, involved in repositories. So, and you can just go on our website and fill in a membership form, and that's essentially it. You send us the membership form, and as long as you adhere to the criteria of being a not-for-profit organization in the field of education or scholarly research, then we'd be happy to have you.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Okay, still further questions here. Besem is still asking, is there a list of open source software which has already been implemented for COAR Notify?
Yes. It was on one of my slides, which I can share with you again. Let me go to that slide for you. Here is the slide. So here are the open source platforms that have been developed: DSpace and Open Preprint Systems and Kotahi, and there's development underway on these other systems here. And planned for Hyrax is a Samvera platform. But, you know, if you know of an open source platform that you are using that's not listed here, in particular a repository platform, let me know, because we're very interested in trying to get as many to be COAR Notify enabled as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that's clear, Besem. All right, I think the next is more like an observation, or is it something virtual? He said we can offer free Crossref membership for some countries in Africa. Okay, I think he's talking respect to what you said previously as regards Indexal Data LLC, which sponsors Crossref or something. Actually, we can make whatever you're saying clear in the chat so I can. All right, there's a follow-up statement from Joe in the chat, and Joe is saying we can strengthen regional publishing ecosystem by choosing African journals and platforms like Baobab, Africa Archive, etc. to disseminate research. Okay. Let me just look through the chat and see if we have more questions.
Just about the issue of DOIs.
Mm-hmm.
We recently launched an initiative at COAR because, you know, DOIs are expensive. They cost about $1 per DOI if you're a Crossref member or a DataCite member. Maybe it's more at Crossref. So I think the stark reality is that not all, that many countries cannot afford to have DOIs for their scholarly outputs. So in Latin America, they've launched a project called the DARK project. DOIs are basically built on something called ARCs. ARCs are persistent identifiers, and DOI is a way of organizing those persistent identifiers. So in Latin America, they've launched their own, it's not a DOI organization, but it's an ARC organization that will provide free of charge PIDs, persistent identifiers to repositories for their individual records. And this is also happening. There's a discussion happening in Africa around that as well. So the problem with the reason why everyone wants Crossref is because Crossref is being used, the aggregation of metadata in Crossref is being used as the official, database of legitimate research outputs. And we know very much that that's not true. And so we have been in discussions with them to say, we're developing these other initiatives. We would like to be interoperable in terms of the metadata that we're creating through this African initiative and the Latin American initiative, and possibly India is also discussing with us because they cannot afford DOIs. China, I'm sure would be very interested in this. And so the idea really is that we need to move the community away from thinking that the aggregation, the database of Crossref articles really represents the legitimate research outputs, because that's not true at all. And it just represents those countries that can afford to pay for a DOI. So we hope in the next few years to be able to really address this issue.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Also, we have another question from Joe. So Joe is asking, how do you envision scholarly publishing? How do you envision scholarly publishing in and within Africa in the next 3 to 5 years?
Good question. I mean, I really hope that the ecosystem, the local publishing ecosystem, has been strengthened significantly. I know there are there's some grants that have been going towards strengthening the diamond open access, which is like, don't pay fees to publish or to access. So, and I think with the possibility of this publish, review, curate model, I think we could have a much more vibrant local publishing system ecosystem, shall we say, in Africa in the next 5 years. And I really hope so. I hope that's the case.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I think There's as much questions as I have in the chat. Okay. So still we have about like 9 more minutes to round up. So if you still have any follow-up question, you still have the opportunity to do that before we touch down to the top of the hour. So feel free to ask whatever question you would like to ask, and then if you feel you want to unmute and ask out loud, you can do that as well. All right, so while we wait for any more questions, let me ask this, Kathleen. So you mentioned during your presentation, you talked about the COAR International Repository Directory and how we can support in populating that as Africa Guide. So this is my question in that regard. So what specific strategies does COAR employ to support open access repository managers like Africa Guide in Africa, and how can African institutions leverage these efforts? Can you just answer this question in line with what you said previously about the COAR International Repository Directory? Just throw more light on that. Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, well, the problem we've had in the past with these directories is that a repository manager would typically submit their information into the directory when they launch the repository, and that would be it. And eventually, after 3-4 years, the repository would upgrade, change its URL. Some repositories, would no longer exist. So they eventually, little by little, become extremely out of date and inaccurate. And then you cannot use them, to be able to give policymakers, for example, a real picture of what the repository landscape is. You can't use them as a researcher if you're looking for a specific repository. So they become sort of useless. And for years, we've been talking about this at COAR. And what we are proposing is a much more community-based model where we would have what we're calling a responsible party take responsibility for the records in a certain country or a certain region. So, for example, I'm based in Canada. The Canadian Association of Research Libraries has a repository community of practice, and they actually, in an Excel sheet, collect all the information about Canadian repositories. So they want to know, and they want the information to be up to date. So really, it's in our interest to be able to work with them to be able to feed that information into an international directory. So this is our proposed model. Of course, not every country and every region is going to have a responsible party that we can work with, but I think it's a much more feasible way to ensure that the records are up to date in the repository directory. And so we would, have those people as part of the governance. We would, on an annual basis, ask them to go and, make sure their records are up to date and that kind of thing. And I know I've been talking to Joe because I know that Africa Archive has already a pretty good database of repositories in Africa. So I think, that, for example, could populate the International Repository Directory already with many more African repositories than exist in the current directories. And then the question is, how do you keep it up to date? Maybe there are some countries in Africa like Ghana that are organized enough and they want to take on managing the records for repositories in Ghana or Nigeria. So I think it would sort of depends on the availability of a an appropriate group or organization that's willing to commit to that.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Joe, would you like to unmute and speak out loud, because I saw you not behind.
I have to admit her. Just give me a second.
Sorry?
I have to admit
okay.
her. Just give me a second.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So yeah, on that note, thanks for explaining, Kathleen, and also Ebuka. So because we found through that list of African institutional repositories, like you just said, that many installations are outdated for DSpace or other systems. But now with Africa Archive hosted on DSpace, we are offering, or this is to where we hope we can help. So what I also wrote in the chat, that if you do not have the capacity to host your own repository, or feel that it's too much burden on the current staff, then we can add a community institutional repository community collection inside the Africa Archive repository for you, which you can still manage yourselves, but the hosting wouldn't be a problem anymore. And as your university builds capacity and over time hopefully receives the necessary funding for the infrastructure setup, you can at any point of time export the repository again to host yourselves. So in that way, we hope to make the scholarly records across the continent available with a minimal technological effort in a centralized manner, and yet community owned. Because as you might be aware, since 2023, Africa Archive is hosted by UbuntuNet Alliance. We're also part of the African Open Science Platform Initiative. And as such, the repository and associated services are basically for the community, and not like it's, so it's basically in the spirit of open science and accessibility and affordability of digital infrastructure. Mary, Harold, that's an opportunity also for Kathleen to add, if that's also in line with how you experience low resource settings can upgrade their visibility and discoverability of the research. Is that in line with COAR's vision and mission? Is that like a valid approach?
Yeah, no, I think we're even seeing that, I guess repositories were originally launched in 2003, 2004, and this started in maybe US and Western Europe. And then every university had their repository, and now they're all saying, wait a minute, we don't all need our repositories. Why don't we use shared infrastructure, because it's much more efficient, cost effective and efficient. Mm-hmm. So I think skipping that, and I mean, shared infrastructure for me is an excellent way to go, and especially in lower resourced environments. So I totally support that.
Yeah, so we have on our website, we have a policy on how we self-assess or self-commit to run the repository based on best practices, core policies, core recommendations, and also other organizations concerned with scholarly publishing. And you can, of course, also have your own institutional or repository specific policy that you apply to the workflows. But if it's about the hosting, we can certainly help. And we also aim to, or we constantly work also with other African publishing entities like AJOL. Wakrin has also a publishing platform that you mentioned in your presentation, Baobab, which is excellent. It's on a different system, not DSpace. And it's Invenio Research Data Management, which is also an excellent state-of-the-art repository system. And with several systems being in play, we have an opportunity to also learn from each other and provide dedicated services to the community.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's important that there's not just one you know, big repository out there, because that's when you get into trouble with, oh, well, somebody pulls the plug on the funding for that one, you know, institution. Whereas if you have several infrastructures, but it's at the right level where, you know, you're sharing resources in some cases, but you're not completely dependent on, you know, a single entity, then I think that's sort of the right balance to try to achieve.
Right. Okay, let's work together. Thanks so much, Kathleen. And since we've passed the top of the hour, thanks for staying a bit longer. Thanks for sharing all this information, Kathleen, and back over to you, Ebuka.
All right. Thank you, Joe, and thanks to Kathleen, and thanks to everyone in the audience. So, like I said, our speaker today has been Kathleen Shearer, and she is the Executive Director of the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, that's COAR for short. And then we've been discussing on the topic, the role of COAR in advancing open access in Africa. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. So we have many more exciting webinars and speakers in our subsequent sessions. Our next webinar session will be announced on our various platforms and channels. So be on the lookout for that. So thank you again to the members of the audience and to our guests, Kathleen Shearer, for making out time to join us today and sharing all of the things you shared with us today in seeing that we help promote, you know, open access in this part of the world. So thank you all, and in the absence of any other thing, it's goodbye from here, and see you in our next session. Thank you. Bye.
Everyone, bye.